to be here today. Remote access by employees is an area that's grown exponentially over the years. It used to be that people would just come to work, they would sit in an office, they would do their work, they would leave for the day. But now 62% of US employees actually work remotely, at least to some extent. And the concept of an employee working remotely is that they're at a location outside of your main place of business, and your main place of business has developed firewalls and all sorts of protections to keep outsiders from accessing the data in your business. And now, in order to allow that remote access, you have to open up paths into your system from the outside. And that's really where the danger is. The employee can't work remotely unless they can make the connection into your system, but opening that connection to the outside raises some risks for your company. And we're going to talk about those a little bit today and about how you can help to minimize those risks. Hackers attacking smartphones and other remote access devices are also growing at an alarming rate, 459% growth annually at this point. And a lot of people have a perception that it's the big public companies in the headlines that are the ones subject to the attacks. But the reality is that those companies have extraordinary cybersecurity at this point because they have been subject to attack. And a lot of attacks now are actually directed at small and mid-sized companies. 62% of cyber attacks actually go to those small and mid-sized companies. And 60% of small businesses that suffer a significant cyber attack are out of business within 6 months. So that's a scary statistic. And the average cost of a cyber attack is $800,000 for a small or mid-sized business. And then they spend an additional $950,000 to restore normal business operations. That's just a cost that a lot of businesses that are small or mid-sized just can't afford, and they end up going out of business. So it's important to avoid this problem in the first place to the extent that you can, and take steps to try to minimize the chance that your remote access employees are going to help access problems for your company. All businesses have some kind of limitations on what they can do, and no security arrangement is going to be perfect. But it makes sense to do things and to take steps that will attempt to at least minimize what the risks are in the context of what your business can actually afford to do. And that includes developing policies and procedures on how you handle your technology, and also a whole host of other things, many of which don't cost a lot of money, but you can implement them and greatly reduce the risks that your business is subject to. One element that comes up when you have remote access employees is what devices are they going to be using in order to access your system from a remote location. Ideally, and in a perfect world, the business would issue all the devices that are going to be used for remote access. If a company issues the device, it has a whole lot more control over what's on those devices, what those devices are used for, and making sure that those devices are up to date in terms of security. But in many cases, businesses, for economic or other reasons, decide that it's okay for a company to allow an employee to use their own personal cell phone to make access, to maybe use their personal computer that's sitting in their bedroom at home, to use a tablet that they may use while they're sitting watching TV at home. And that opens up a lot of complications. Each of those devices may be made by various different manufacturers. They may have different operating systems. There may be Apple operating systems on some, Android operating systems on others. Your network has to, one, be compatible to operate with all these different operating systems. And because they're different operating systems, issues come up with them in different ways, so that Apple may discover that there's a problem in its operating system and comes up with a patch. Android may come up with an entirely different issue in its system and issues a patch. But if you don't have one uniform arrangement within your company, you've got to keep track of all the patches for all the different manufacturers, all the different software that's on these devices that are being used remotely. That can get complicated for a company. Again, much simpler if the company can just have one type of software and operating system on every device that's going to be used, and make sure that the patches for those are up to date at any given point in time. You also want to have restrictions on the usage that you make of these devices, ideally. If employees are taking these devices, and again, particularly if they're their own personal device, in theory, they have the right to just go anywhere on the internet, download whatever software, whatever games they think might be interesting, and there's only so much you can do unless you have a clear policy and everybody's agreed to abide by that. And if people are allowed to just use their device for anything, it opens up a lot more avenues where you go and see something interesting on the internet, you download it because it sounds like a fun personal thing to do. It may contain some kind of malware, and once the malware is into the employee's device, once they open up the authorized connection to the company, which they're allowed to do as an employee, all of a sudden that malware is transferred into your entire system, and somebody may be in there looking through all the information that you have at the company. Ideally, again, you want to put restrictions on what people put on their devices, and this is much more difficult to do if the company doesn't own the device. There's also just checking on whether people have downloaded the patches that need to be put in place, because those patches are there to prevent hackers from entering into the device. If you have your company issued devices, you may require the employee to periodically bring those devices in, make sure that they're up to date in all their software and updates that need to be made. Whereas if it's just a PC that they have personally and it's sitting at home, you may never see what's going on there, and that's not going to make your system safe. If the patches are going to be installed, you have to make sure they're done regularly, and just as important, you have to make sure that people are updating from the authorized software company that is supposed to be issuing the patch. A lot of times hackers will know that people are supposed to update their software, and they will try to send emails out to people, and the emails will say, it's time for an update of your operating system. Hit download and you will receive the upload and make sure your device is safe. But in fact, it's just a hacker who's sending this out, and if you hit the install, again, you're just downloading some kind of malware onto your system. You're making problems for your company, and always make sure that the patches are downloaded strictly from, for example, the authorized Microsoft site or Apple site, wherever it is. Another element, and John and I are both going to talk about some of these subjects. I'm just going to touch on them quickly in some cases here. But two-factor authentication. If an employee is accessing your system remotely, they are making an authorized connection to your system. If the company is allowing them in, the company wants to make sure that it's truly the employee and not that mythical 400-pound person sitting on a bed somewhere. It's got to be the employee who's making the access. And if someone is clever enough to find out the employee's passwords in whatever manner they do, or can guess them because they're not very sophisticated, you know, again, use your password as password. That's the password. If a hacker can just try that and see if it works, all of a sudden they have an authorized connection into the company and they can get access to whatever they need to get access to. And so two-factor authentication tries to come up with another confirmation that it truly is the employee that's making the access connection here. Apple has put together certain programs where you get a code sent to your device, and Apple can then detect that this is a trusted device and therefore it is the right one that's allowing the access, and it's not purely just the password. Sometimes there are tokens that are issued, and if the token is with the device that's being used, that means that it can confirm that it's the right person trying to access the system, and it lets it through. And more these days, we're also seeing situations where biometrics are used, where the device, for example, your phone, can look at your retina, it can look at your fingerprint, and it can confirm that it's really you. And obviously that's hard to fake. So that helps to confirm that it is in fact the employee who's trying to access and not just someone who's learned the employee's password. Encryption is also a way to try to protect information. If encryption is basically taking an algorithm and scrambling the data, and if you have the key, you can understand exactly what the data is, but if you don't have the key, it's just a mishmash, and it's not much of use to anyone. Encryption at rest is the idea that the device, that the information on your device is encrypted while it's just sitting there. So that if, for example, you leave your phone behind at a Starbucks and somebody walks off with it, they may be able to guess your password, they may be able to get into it, but if all they can see is encrypted data, they may not have any use for it, and so therefore no harm may actually be done beyond the economic loss of your phone. Encryption in transit is taking the concept that when you're actually transmitting the data, that data has been encrypted, so that again, if someone can somehow intercept the connection between you and the system at work, they may get in, they may see what the data going back and forth is, but if they can't unscramble it, then again, it's unintelligible. They can't actually make any use of it to harm your business. Virtual private networks is just an available commercial technology. It's not complicated, but it, again, sets up a virtual private network that makes a connection between your device and work, and it encrypts it. And conceptually, it's like trying to create a tunnel directly between your device and work, which makes it hard for anyone to actually see what's going on in that connection. Public Wi-Fi. Probably not something that's ever good to use, but if you do have to use it, try to, at a minimum, not put any sensitive information in the communications that you're making while you're on a public Wi-Fi network. You just don't know where that public Wi-Fi is coming from in many cases. It's very simple to set up a little device in a corner of a room someplace which sends out a Wi-Fi signal, and it looks official, and it says public Wi-Fi, free public Wi-Fi, what could be better? And in fact, what you're doing is you're making a connection with someone who's just trying to collect your data. And it may pass you through to the internet, but in between you making the connection with them and reaching the internet, it's actually looking at everything you're doing and potentially getting into your device, getting into your system. So public Wi-Fi, if you have to use it, try not to use any kind of communications that are very sensitive. And also use a VPN connection if that's possible. And it's probably not a bad idea for employees when they're just wandering around with their devices, not actually using Wi-Fi, to just turn off the Wi-Fi connection so you don't end up making any inadvertent Wi-Fi connections by your device just reaching out to whatever happens to be passing by. Network monitoring. is a more elaborate system, and it's something that gets set up at the company itself. But there are technologies out there that can monitor your system and look at the communications that come in, the usage that's done on any given time in any different way of how your network is used, and they'll establish baselines of what's normal in your company. And every company is a little different. You can't just say that this is a problem if there's a unusual memory use in this particular area at a given time. There may be very good reasons for that. But if there's a baseline that's been collected, then this technology and this software can monitor when there are changes in that baseline and send out notices. And if you get notice that something unusual is happening, you can look into it quickly, and the best chance you have of avoiding serious problems is if you can catch the problems as they're first occurring. So that's something that's also out there that companies can consider looking at. The cloud is not something that's directly tied in with remote employees, but conceptually, essentially, it's remote access for your entire server system. So just give some thought to the connections. The cloud can make a lot of sense. You know, your company makes widgets. You're not in the business of IT necessarily, and it can make sense to turn over that to a company that, in fact, does specialize in making sure that the digital security for your company is state of the art. And it can be, you know, a good use of resources to store your data in that way. But it is, at the end of the day, a remote access connection to your data, and you have to make sure that the provider that you're using is responsible, has the appropriate technology for the type of business that you're in, the type of data that you're likely to have, the type of backup that you're likely to need. Least privilege is the concept that not everybody needs to see everything in your system. So that if you're granting remote access to your employees, maybe some employees don't really need remote access at all, so you just don't grant it to them. Some employees may need to see email, but maybe that's all they need. And others may need to see certain types of documentation, but not your finances. And a very small number of people may need access to certain very sensitive information that you have. By sort of segmenting your network at the company and providing only access to those people that particularly need a type of information, you can at least, in many cases, minimize the damage that's done if someone does hack and find a way to use that employee's remote access. If they can only access certain limited portions of your network, then at least the rest of the network is safe, hopefully. And one last area that is extremely important is your employees. Everybody tends to think of cybersecurity as something that deals with technology and software and how sophisticated that technology and software is. But the reality is that about 62% of successful hacks actually start with social engineering, which is someone just tricking an employee into doing something that they really shouldn't do. And it's not something horrendous, but it may just be clicking on a link, opening up a document, and your first line of defense for remote employees should be really dealing with a lot of these social engineering issues. And in many cases, these will just start with an email, and someone will send an email to an employee, and in many cases, you can go to your website and find all the employees' email addresses. They use that. You also, because you're in the business of promoting your company and its business, you on your website tend to put up notices of interesting events that people have gone to, conferences that they've just spoken to. It's not that hard for someone to just go onto your website, look at that information, look at the email addresses, and then they send a crafted email that says, I was at the conference you were just speaking at on Tuesday, and here's a an article I did on a subject very similar, and I would like your thoughts on it. And all of a sudden, they open up that document, and who knows what's in the document, but once it's opened, it releases malware into your system, and all of a sudden somebody's got access to your system in ways that they never should have had. And remote employees are particularly sensitive to these kind of situations, because if you're just working at the office and something a little odd comes up, maybe you just walk down the hallway and ask one of your IT people, is this something that's a problem? Can you take a look at this? If you're on the road and you're trying to do a million things at once and you've got to rush off onto something new within the next couple of minutes, something comes in, you're by your nature as an employee trying to serve people, trying to be responsive to what's coming to you. There's a tendency to just try to help out and try to work with whatever's coming in. That's much more difficult to deal with than if you're just sitting in an office somewhere and you can ask somebody, even if it's somebody next to you who's not an IT person, but just, does this look weird to you? When you're by yourself, you're in a hurry, it's a lot more easy to just run off and end up doing something that you shouldn't do. So employee training to make sure that your employees are sensitive to the kinds of things that these social engineering attacks bring about and the kind of ways that they tend to come in is something that is extremely important. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it's something that can really be critical to making sure that you avoid unnecessary issues with remote employees. And with that, I'm going to pass things along to John Calley, who's going to take us home with a lot of important information that he has.
Thank you, Bob. So what I tried to do here on the first slide is to give you our experience as a company and where the most likely sources of threats come from. Phishing emails and pop-ups Bob just mentioned. You know, since the software makers are patching their software and the browser companies are patching their software a lot more often to eliminate threats, the hackers are turning to phishing emails and crafting them, using AI to craft them to trick employees into clicking on links or attachments. So that we see that as probably the #1 way that companies are exploited by hackers. The second one, not necessarily in an order, but insider abuse, internet access or email. You have employees that are checking their own personal email at work or going to websites that contain malware, not intentionally, but you know, they start by going to you know, like a general website, and they start clicking through, and they're really not sure, you know, where it's taking them, but they might see an article that they want to read, so they'll click on it, and it may be you know, bait to get you to click on the link, and actually will take you to maybe an article, but it might have embedded in it some malware that you could get. And we call those things drive-by downloads or exploits, because you're actually clicking on a link, it's taken you to a website that could have either ads or documents that have exploits contained in them. The next item is removable media, USB drives. Everybody has a thumb drives. They want to take you know, something home to work on it. They plug it into their home computer. They do their work. Then they take it back to work, plug it in. And a lot of times, if that computer that they're using at home might be used by the family, especially kids that go to game websites, it could infect the computer, and then when you're creating and working on your document, it could place that malware on your USB device, that when you bring it back to work and plug it in, now you're infecting the work network. So you have to be very careful with allowing employees to use USB drives to transfer files back and forth. The next thing is open or weak remote access. Bob talked about remote accessing from outside. And use of simple passwords. And I'm going to get into passwords in a little while for remote access sessions. If you have remote access that doesn't employ two-factor authentication, that's the easiest and safest way that you can implement it safely, as well as making passwords a little longer than people are used to. And then just device loss and theft. People have company data on their cell phones these days, and what you want to do is you want to make sure that that you have the ability to wipe their phones or wipe their laptops in the event that they're lost or stolen. So those are the 5 ways that we're seeing the most likely source of threats. So what I'm going to talk to you now is the most cost-effective security measures that you can do for remote access. Number 1 is using Microsoft Remote Desktop Services, the application that's on every Windows PC. The reason that we recommend that is it's easy to keep it updated, since the software automatically gets updated with Windows. It's patched whenever you do a Windows update. That software, if it has an exploit, will get patched as well. Some of the commercially available softwares that allow you to do remote desktop may not be patched as well, or maybe you'll run it without doing an update before you use that program. The next thing is network level authentication. So when you log into when you log in remotely to the network, you want to make sure that it's being you want to make sure that it's being authenticated by your company network. A lot of people use third-party software that just allows them to directly access their PC without being authenticated by their network. Okay, the next thing is limit the number of users that can log in using RDP. I guess, in some companies that we've gone into, we see that everyone can see everything. There's really no permission structure or setup. And what happens with that is, if you log in, you have access to everything on that network. If you don't limit that to have people access only the data that they need to do their job, what happens is they have free reign on your network once they're in. So we want to limit the number of users to only those that need remote access, and then those that do shouldn't have admin rights to the rest of the data when they get into the network. Number 4, you set an account lockout policy by either the number of attempts or incorrect guesses, so that if someone's trying to hack in and they guess the wrong password 3 times, they're locked out until an administrator can let them back in. That helps cut down on people trying to guess your password when they're logging in remotely. And Bob mentioned, using tools that log RDP sessions. There are tools out there that your company can put on your network to monitor and analyze the logs. One that we've seen that we like is ManageEngine's Event Log Analyzer. That's a tool that allows the company to analyze logs. It keeps records of everything that's going on your network. And then two-factor authentication for RDP. That's an easy, inexpensive way, and Bob mentioned this, to keep people from hacking into your network. They may guess your password or have your password that they purchased on the dark web, but unless they have your cell phone, it makes it very difficult for them to get into your network with just a password. Okay, so what are some best practices? Well, no single security technology protects against all threats that businesses face. We always recommend layered security. It's a best practice. And that means that, you would have software at the gateway to your internet that will protect the internal network before it ever gets there. And if it gets by that, you put different software on the endpoints to be able to protect against viruses and malware. And again, as Bob mentioned, don't overlook your human firewalls. It's the employee training to have them spot email that may contain a link or a download that will infect your network. So you want the human firewalls are the people sitting behind the keyboard. You want to make sure that they're trained to be suspect of any link or any download that they receive by email. One of the things that that Bob talked about is when you're using public Wi-Fi, don't use it for anything important. But the safest way, instead of using public Wi-Fi, is to use your hotspot on your phone. If you have to get on a network or access your company network, use the internet service that's provided and the hotspot that's provided on the phone. Most phones these days have hotspots built into the operating system, whether it's Android or iPhone. That's one way that you're not using the public Wi-Fi, but you still have access to the internet. And then last, just continuous user education. Like I said, the hackers are using social engineering to craft these emails. So they use artificial intelligence and they see what works and what doesn't, and they continue to tweak the email so that you can to trick you into clicking on links and going to certain places. So if you're doing all of these things, it's 100% effective some of the time. So you can't, even if you're employing all of these, it doesn't mean you're 100% protected, but it certainly puts you in a much better position to thwart any kind of attacks. Okay, I'm going to do a quick, I'm going to go into the passwords section of my talk, and I'm doing a little bit of a poll here. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you'd be able to answer the poll question, which password is harder to crack, number 1 or number 2? Can everyone just take a second and choose? And we'll just wait 1 second while you're answering that question. And we still have more coming in. Just take a moment and do it. I always like to ask this question because as time goes on, it's difficult to crack different types of passwords. So, okay, I think we have the results of the poll in, and more than 90% of the people selected number 1, which is an 8-character complex password. It has numbers, letters, capitals, and an exclamation point. This is my password. Seems very innocent. It has, it's just English. This is my password. If you'll notice, password is misspelled. It's not an English dictionary word. And so if you pick number 2, you are correct. That is the harder one to password. So 90% to crack. Number 1, which most people selected, is the easiest actually. If you think about it, length trumps complexity every time. So if you were to look at a 8-character password that's complex, it actually takes a hacker less than 15 minutes to crack that password with today's password cracking software and computer systems that are running faster and faster every day. For common word password, if you'll notice password is misspelled, it actually takes 3 months and 22 days. There's 2 columns there. One is HSIMP, which is how secure is my password. That's actually a website you can go to, and the pass fault analyzer, which is another website you can go to check to see how long it would take a hacker to crack your password. I always suggest using pass fault analyzer. I like that website a lot better, and I'm always erring on the side of quickness. And you can see that it takes much less, they're estimating it takes much less time for a hacker to crack it. And if you go to Passfault Analyzer, there's a number of options you can pick right underneath where you put your password in. And you can see this is just using a standard computer with standard software to crack it. But you can change the criteria to be more complex, like they have password cracking hardware that hackers can employ, and it actually dramatically reduces the time it takes for them to hack it. So, you can go to, I would suggest that you go to Passfault Analyzer, put your password in just to see how long it would take to crack. And that's a good way to tell if you need to change your password. So again, if you're looking at the difference between, and this is length versus complexity. So if you look at password 1, it's 16 characters, all lowercase. It would take, using Passfault Analyzer, 330 centuries to crack. So basically you're secure forever. If you take that simple phrase and add 1 punctuation to it and 1 capital, it jumps up to 8.5 million centuries. And if you add a little bit of complexity by adding a pound sign and a question mark, it jumps up to 1.2, I guess that's a lot of centuries. So essentially you're really protected. And the one thing I wanted to point out is, through 20 years of effort, we successfully trained everyone to use passwords that are hard for us to remember, but easy for computers to guess. It's been ingrained into everybody's head that you should have 8-character complex passwords. The problem with that is it was the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, came out with this probably 10 years ago. The guy who wrote the policy actually read a white paper and said, oh, this sounds good. This is what we're going to do. And at the time, 10 years ago, that was probably okay. But a year and a half ago, after there had been a lot of password exploits, they went back and re-looked at that policy. And now what's happened is they changed it to be, 16-character passwords or passphrases. And what happens is the longer they are, the longer it takes to crack. But if it takes centuries to crack, you never should have to change it, because what happens is when we change the passwords, we tend to dumb it down. I'm sure you have passwords that you're asked to change every 30 or 90 days, and you add a 1 or a 2 or a 3 at the end. That's not making it any more difficult to crack. I mean, to stay safe. What you really want to do is you want to change, you don't want to change them. You want to make it long, and so you never have to change it. The only time you need to change it is if your password is part of an exploit, just like the Facebook hack that happened earlier this week. So length versus complexity every time. Use a passphrase, not a word, but a phrase. They're easier to remember. Don't use all English dictionary words. Put some misspellings in there. Easiest to get a password manager that automatically generates them. LastPass, RoboForm I've used and I like them. Dashlane, there's another one called 1Password that seem to be pretty effective that a lot of people use. I'd say do that. The other thing is don't disclose your password to anyone, and please don't write it down. When our engineers are out in the field, they're asking the user whose PC they're sitting in front for their password. A lot of times it's on a sticky note on the screen. It's under their mouse pad or under their keyboard or in their right-hand drawer or in the center drawer in front of them. All they have to do is open the drawer and there's their password. Don't write it down. Don't use the same password over and over again on different sites. Again, if you were part of the Facebook exploit that just happened and you're using that password, on different sites, then what the hackers do is they buy the passwords and logins as a pair, and they try them at every website. The other thing I tell employers is don't allow your employees to use their personal passwords for business. In other words, their business passwords that you're using on Facebook, LinkedIn, or any other site is going to be separate than the one you're using for business. Because if you really don't care what they're doing on their personal time, but you don't want them using those same passwords. And just to kind of put an exclamation point on that, there had been exploits in 2018 alone, besides the Facebook breach, where 50 million user accounts just a few days ago. Exactus happened in June for 340 million accounts. Under Armour in May had 150 million accounts compromised. MyHeritage, which is a genealogy platform, had 92 million. Panera Bread in April had 73 million. So if they were part of any of those breaches and they're using the same passwords to access your network as they were for their own personal things, it could be a problem for you. So awareness is another important key. If you're on the dark web monitoring and alerting, we offer that service as part of our cybersecurity offering, and basically it discovers signs of compromised credentials. It constantly looks at botnets, chat rooms, peer-to-peer networks, malicious websites, bulletin boards, blogs, and illegal black market sites to find if there's any pairs, any compromised credentials that anyone in your company might have. I did want to mention that for anyone that's attending the webinar, we are doing a complimentary courtesy scan, and you'll be getting an email. If you signed up by the end of business yesterday, you'll be getting a complimentary email that will show you how many exploits using your company URL that exists for your company. So, as an example with mine, we did a search on trinitywww.com, and if there were any exploits, you'll be receiving an email with that number of exploits. If there were 0, congratulations. There were a few that did have zeros, but not many. So, congratulations to you for that. If for any reason you didn't have a chance to sign up before yesterday, you can go to our website, www.trinitywww.com/darkweb, and that will take you to a landing page where you can put your information in along with your domain. And if you just put in the comment section, free scan, we'll do a free complimentary scan and email it to you. Okay, so I just want you to know one thing. Cyber criminals have all day long to crack your passwords, and they use advanced algorithms that can try tens of millions of possible password combinations per second. So the idea is to have long passwords and that are difficult to crack. Okay, so I always like to give a bonus whenever I speak. So if you want to see if your passwords are exposed, there is a public website you can go to, Have I Been PWNED, which is owned, and that's hacker talk for owned. So it's haveibeenpwned.com, and you can put a password in there to see if I think you put your login name there. And what that does is it tells you if your login name has ever been part of a compromise. I know that a while back, mine was part of a LinkedIn compromise, and if it is there, what you want to do is you want to change the password that you're using for that site, and also if you're using that password for any other site, you want to change it. You can go to PassVault, as I mentioned before, to see how long it would take a hacker to crack your password. And then I put the URLs for 3 of the password managers that we would recommend, and the other one is 1Password, which is not there. And again, just remember, tell your employees to use different passwords for business and personal. That's really important. So with that, I'm done with my presentation. Again, you can go to the website trinitywww.com/darkweb, and if you didn't register before yesterday, and we'll send you a complimentary dark web scan for your company. And that's it.
And we'll just open it up that if you have any questions that John or I can be of help with, we're happy to take some questions at this point. And
We'll open it up.
we'll see for if anyone has any questions. And
Hold on. All right.
And if everyone was completely satisfied with all the answers that they received, apparently, then I guess we will wrap this up. And thank you for attending our webinar. And John and my contact information is in the materials that you received. And so, again, if you have any questions that come up after this, we're both happy to talk with you and deal with any questions that you may have. And thank you for attending.
Thank you.